July 7, 1943. The skies above the Kursk salient, Soviet Union. Lieutenant Mikhail Grishin sat in the cockpit of his Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, hands gripping the control column as his aircraft juddered through the turbulent air at 320 feet. Below him, stretched across the scorched Russian steppe, were the tanks of the German 9th Panzer Division. Dozens of them, Panthers, Mark IVs, and among them, the machines that had become symbols of invincible German armor, Tigers. His bomb bay doors were already open. Inside, nestled in 4 cassettes, were 192 small bomblets. Each one weighed just 5.5 pounds. The German tank crews below had no idea what was about to hit them. Neither did Lieutenant Grishin. He was carrying, for the first time in combat, a weapon that German intelligence had never seen before. A weapon so simple, so unassuming in its design, that Luftwaffe pilots would later dismiss it as a toy. But in the next 20 minutes, those toys would obliterate 70 tanks of the 9th Panzer Division and contribute to halting the largest German offensive on the Eastern Front since 1941. This is the story of how a 2.5-kilogram shaped charge bomb, developed in secret Soviet workshops just months earlier, changed the nature of armored warfare forever. And how German panzer crews, who had rolled across Europe believing themselves untouchable, learned that their greatest vulnerability was not the enemy in front of them, but the sky above. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The relationship between aircraft and tanks had been evolving since tanks first appeared on the Western Front in 1916. But by 1943, military doctrine on both sides held certain assumptions as fundamental truth. Tanks were vulnerable to air attack, yes, but only under specific circumstances. A direct hit from a heavy bomb could destroy a tank. Rockets, when they connected, could penetrate armor. Heavy cannon fire, particularly the 37mm guns mounted on specialized tank-hunting aircraft, could disable a tank with sustained fire. The problem was accuracy. Bombs required steep dive angles and split-second timing. Most missed. Rockets were notoriously imprecise. Even the vaunted German Stuka dive bomber, equipped with twin 37mm anti-tank cannons under its wings, could only achieve kills against stationary targets or vehicles that had already been immobilized. The mathematics of the problem were simple. A tank presented a target roughly 6 meters long and 3 meters wide. An aircraft moving at 300 kilometers per hour had seconds to line up a shot. Wind, altitude, the tank's movement, the aircraft's angle of attack, all of these variables conspired against accuracy. Soviet pilots flying ground attack missions in 1941 and 42 had learned this lesson bitterly. They would expend rockets and cannon ammunition against German armor columns, see hits, see explosions, and report tanks destroyed. Then ground forces would arrive to find the same tanks still operational, their thick frontal and side armor barely scratched. The top armor was different. Tank designers had always known this. The top of a tank, the engine deck, the turret roof, these surfaces were protected by armor 30 to 50 millimeters thick. Sometimes less. It was a calculated compromise. Thicker top armor meant more weight, which meant slower speeds and greater fuel consumption. And attacks from directly above seemed unlikely. Artillery shells descended at steep angles, yes, but artillery pieces were positioned kilometers away and fired over such distances that precise targeting of individual tanks was nearly impossible. Aircraft could attack from above, but bombing accuracy made direct hits rare. So tank designers accepted the vulnerability. They had to. The Soviet engineer who would exploit this vulnerability was named Ivan Alexandrovich Larionov. He worked at TSKB-22, a design bureau specializing in ordnance and fuses. In mid-1942, Larionov proposed something radical. He wanted to adapt shaped charge technology, the principle used in anti-tank rifle grenades and specialized artillery shells, into a bomblet small enough to be carried by aircraft in large numbers. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. A shaped charge bomb did not rely on kinetic energy or explosive force alone. It used a carefully designed cone of metal, typically copper, positioned above an explosive charge. When the explosive detonated, it collapsed the cone inward at tremendous velocity, forming a superheated jet of metal plasma that could burn through steel armor like a cutting torch. The physics had been understood since the 1930s. What Larionov proposed was miniaturization. A shaped charge warhead weighing just 1.5 kilograms, wrapped in a thin steel casing designed to look like a standard 2.5 kilogram fragmentation bomb. Total weight 2.5 kilograms. Small enough that an IL-2 Sturmovik could carry dozens of them. Light enough that they would tumble and scatter when released, blanketing an area rather than requiring precision. And powerful enough to penetrate 60 to 70 millimeters of steel armor. Enough to punch through the top of any German tank then in service, including the Tiger. Development accelerated through early 1943. Soviet aviation facilities worked on stabilizing the bomblet's descent. The fuse had to be reliable, detonating on impact with sufficient force to activate the shaped charge jet. Too sensitive, and the bomblets would detonate when they struck each other during release. Too insensitive, and they would bounce off tank armor without detonating. The prototypes went through dozens of iterations. By April 1943, Stalin himself had approved production. Nearly 1 million units were ordered. The designation was PTAB 2.51.5, Protovotankovaya Aviationaya Bomba, anti-tank aviation bomb. The Battle of Kursk had been brewing for months. After the disaster at Stalingrad, where the German Sixth Army had been encircled and destroyed, the Wehrmacht needed a victory. Not a tactical adjustment or a successful withdrawal, a crushing, decisive victory that would restore German momentum on the Eastern Front and prove to the world that the Red Army could still be defeated. The target was obvious. During the spring thaw of 1943, Soviet forces had pushed westward, liberating Kursk and creating a massive bulge in the German lines. The salient extended nearly 200 kilometers into German-held territory, a tempting target for a classic pincer movement. If German forces could attack from both the north and south simultaneously, they could encircle and destroy the Soviet armies trapped inside. Operation Citadel. That was the code name. General Kurt Zeitzler had devised the plan. Adolf Hitler had approved it, though with reservations. Field Marshal Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, had opposed it entirely. He believed the operation risked Germany's armored reserves for minimal strategic gain. Hitler delayed the offensive multiple times. He wanted Germany's newest tanks, the Panther and the Tiger, to arrive in sufficient numbers. He wanted the Ferdinand tank destroyer, a massive 70-ton vehicle mounting an 88mm gun, to be ready. Each delay gave the Soviets more time to prepare. And they were preparing. Soviet intelligence, aided by the Lucy spy ring operating in Switzerland and by British intelligence sharing decrypted German communications, knew the attack was coming. They knew the target. They knew the timing. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding Soviet defensive forces, convinced Stalin to hold off on a planned summer offensive. Let the Germans attack, Zhukov argued. Let them exhaust themselves against prepared defenses. Then counterattack with overwhelming force. 300,000 civilians were mobilized. They dug trenches, constructed anti-tank ditches, laid minefields. The defensive system stretched for miles in depth. Multiple fortified lines, each one designed to slow and disrupt German armor. Tank traps, bunkers, pre-sighted artillery positions. And everywhere, mines. Soviet engineers laid more than 3,000 mines per kilometer of front in some sectors. When German forces finally launched Operation Citadel on the 5th of July 1943, they advanced into perhaps the most heavily fortified defensive zone in military history. Over 2 million men were about to collide. 35,000 artillery pieces, 6,250 tanks and assault guns, 4,900 aircraft. The opening day was chaos. German armor, spearheaded by Tiger tanks and Ferdinand tank destroyers, smashed gaps in Soviet defenses but at terrible cost. Minefields channeled German attacks into kill zones where dug-in Soviet anti-tank guns waited. The Luftwaffe and the Soviet VVS, the Red Air Force, fought for control of the skies. On the 5th of July alone, 176 Soviet aircraft were shot down. German losses were 26. The Luftwaffe achieved air superiority over the southern sector of the salient almost immediately. German pilots were more experienced, their tactics more refined. Many of them were veterans with dozens or hundreds of aerial victories. But the Soviets had numbers. And they had something else. Something the Germans would not understand until it was too late. On the morning of June 5, 1943, weeks before the German offensive began, pilots of the 291st Assault Aviation Regiment had loaded their IL-2 Sturmovix with a new type of ordnance. The ground crews had been told nothing except that these were anti-tank bombs. Special. Classified. The cassettes holding the bomblets were sealed. The pilots were instructed to release them from altitudes between 70 and 100 meters, directly over enemy armor. No steep dives. No precision required. Just fly over the target and release. That first combat use had been a test. A German armored column moving along a road. The Sturmovix approached in their standard attack formation, peeled off one at a time and made their runs. The bomb bay doors opened. The cassettes split. 192 small objects tumbled through the air, spreading across an area 70 meters long and 15 meters wide. Then impacts. Not the single thunderous explosion of a standard bomb, but dozens of smaller detonations, a cascade of shape-charged jets burning through steel. When Soviet reconnaissance arrived, they found burning vehicles and abandoned tanks. Crews had fled. Those who stayed inside had died. The PTAB had worked. By July, production had ramped up. Thousands of the bomblets were stockpiled at forward airfields. As Operation Citadel began, Soviet ground attack regiments received their full allocation. Now, IL-2 pilots flying against German armor were no longer relying on imprecise rockets or the hope of a lucky bomb hit. They were carrying area-effect anti-tank weapons that required only that they fly over their target and release. The 9th Panzer Division was part of Field Marshal Walter Model's Northern Pincer. Their objective was to drive south, punch through Soviet defenses, and link up with German forces attacking from the opposite direction. On paper, the division was formidable. It included dozens of Panzer Mark IV tanks, the backbone of German armor. It had Panthers, Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34, with sloped armor and a powerful 75mm gun. And it had Tigers. The Tiger I was a legend before it ever reached Kursk. 60 tons of armor and firepower. Frontal armor 100mm thick. An 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. Slow, mechanically unreliable, fuel-hungry, yes, but in direct combat nearly invincible. Soviet tank crews had learned to fear them. Engagement doctrine against Tigers was simple. Don't engage frontally. Flank them. Use numbers. Accept losses. Or call in artillery and hope. German panzer crews believed in their machines. They had rolled across Poland, France, North Africa, and deep into the Soviet Union. They knew Soviet tanks could destroy them, yes. Soviet anti-tank guns were lethal. But aircraft? Aircraft were a harassment, a nuisance. You kept moving. You kept your intervals wide. You watched for dive bombers. And if you saw Sturmovix coming, you buttoned up the hatches and waited for them to pass. The IL-2 could hurt you if you were unlucky. A rocket could disable your tracks. Cannon fire could damage external equipment. But destruction from the air was rare. Tanks killed tanks. That was the rule. On July 7th, the 9th Panzer Division was advancing through broken terrain northeast of the village of Panayrai. Progress had been slow. Soviet minefields had forced the column to bunch up, moving along narrow cleared paths. Engineers swept for mines as they advanced. Infantry moved alongside the tanks, clearing strong points. And overhead, Soviet aircraft appeared and disappeared in waves. Luftwaffe fighters were supposed to provide cover, but there were never enough of them. And the Sturmovix kept coming. Lieutenant Mikhail Grishin's regiment had been flying continuous sorties since the offensive began. 3 missions on the 5th, for on the 6th, the losses had been terrible. German anti-aircraft fire was intense. Luftwaffe fighters, particularly the Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, were deadly. But Soviet commanders were willing to trade losses for results. Stalin himself had demanded maximum effort against German armor. The IL-2 Sturmovik was not a beautiful aircraft. It was not fast or maneuverable. Western observers called it crude. German pilots called it the concrete bomber. mocking both its durability and its handling. But it could absorb punishment that would destroy any other aircraft. The front section of the fuselage, from the engine to just behind the cockpit, was built from 12 millimeters of armor plate. Not armor bolted to the aircraft. The armor was the structure. Pilot and engine were encased in a steel bathtub that could withstand 20-millimeter cannon fire. The rear gunner in later models sat behind 13 millimeters of plate armor. This made the aircraft heavy and slow. Maximum speed, 414 kilometers per hour. In a straight line, any German fighter could catch it. In a turning fight, the Sturmovik was hopelessly outmatched. So Soviet pilots developed tactics. The circle of death. 8 Sturmoviks would form a defensive circle, each aircraft protecting the one ahead with its forward-firing machine guns. When a German fighter tried to attack, it faced fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. One by one, Sturmoviks would peel off from the circle, make their attack run against ground targets, then rejoin the formation. It was crude but effective. Losses remained high, but missions continued. On the morning of July 7th, Grishin's regiment received their target assignment. 9th Panzer Division. Map coordinates provided. Expected resistance, heavy. They would fly in groups of 8. 3 groups total. 24 aircraft. Grishin was not the most experienced pilot in the regiment. He had fewer than 50 combat missions. Some of the veterans had flown over 100. But he had survived this long, which meant something. He checked his bomb load before takeoff. The cassettes were loaded. 192 PTAB bomblets. He had flown with them twice before. The results, reported by ground forces, had been extraordinary. Destroyed tanks, immobilized vehicles, crews abandoning their machines. This was different from anything else they carried. The takeoff was routine. The flight to the target area took 20 minutes. As they approached, Grishin could see smoke rising from multiple points across the landscape. The battlefield, artillery fire, burning vehicles. The formations of German tanks were visible below, dark shapes moving through the fields. His group leader waggled his wings. The signal to begin. They dropped to attack altitude, 320 feet. Low enough that German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground could track them easily. High enough that the bomblets would have time to arm and spread properly. The German flak opened up. Tracers arced toward them. Black puffs of 88mm shells burst in the air. Grishin felt the aircraft shudder as shrapnel hit the armor. The noise was deafening even through his leather helmet. One aircraft in his group took a direct hit and fell away, trailing fire. He didn't see it impact. He was focused on his approach. The tanks were below him now. He could see their camouflage patterns. He could see infantry moving between them. He pressed the release. The bomb bay doors were already open. The cassettes ejected. For containers, each holding 48 bomblets. They split apart in midair as designed, scattering their contents across the formation below. Grishin banked hard, trying to gain altitude and speed. He looked back. The explosions were different from standard bombs. Not single massive blasts. Dozens of smaller detonations, concentrated, intense, like flashbulbs going off in rapid sequence. Then the secondary explosions began. Fuel tanks igniting, ammunition cooking off. Smoke poured from multiple tanks. He saw crews bailing out, running from their vehicles. His wingman made his run. Then the third aircraft in their element. The flak was relentless. Another Sturmovik took hits and fell away. But the rest of the group completed their attacks and turned east, back toward their own lines. They flew low, hugging the terrain, trying to stay below German fighter altitude. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s dove on them from above. The rear gunners opened fire. Tracers crisscrossed the sky. One of the German fighters broke off. The other pressed his attack, cannon shells ripping into one of the Sturmoviks. The aircraft held together long enough for the pilot to make a forced landing behind Soviet lines. Grishin made it back to the airfield. His aircraft had taken 17 hits. None had penetrated the armored bathtub. The ground crew patched the holes with sheet metal. Within 2 hours, he was airborne again. Same target, same tactics, By the end of the day, his regiment had flown 47 sorties against the 9th Panzer Division. The German after-action reports from July 7th tell the story from the other side. The reports are clinical, precise, and increasingly desperate. Heavy air attacks throughout the day. Multiple tanks immobilized by unknown ordnance. Casualties moderate. Advance slowed. By evening, the tone had changed. Sustained attack by ground attack aircraft. Losses severe. Tanks destroyed by anti-tank bombs of new type. Penetration through top armor. Advance halted. Soviet records claimed the destruction of 70 tanks from the 9th Panzer Division in just 20 minutes. German records dispute the exact number. 70 total losses in a single attack seems unlikely, but something unprecedented had happened. The 9th Panzer Division's advance had been stopped cold. Not by Soviet tanks. Not by anti-tank guns. By aircraft dropping bombs that weighed 5.5 pounds. The psychological impact was immediate. German tank crews had operated under the assumption that they were safe from air attack as long as they kept moving and maintained proper spacing. That assumption was now shattered. The PTAB bomblets carpeted entire areas. Spacing didn't matter. The shape-charged jets burned through the thinnest part of their armor, the part they couldn't reinforce without making their vehicles too heavy to move. German commanders began ordering tanks to halt and disperse when Soviet ground attack aircraft appeared. This was exactly what Soviet ground forces needed. A halted tank is a stationary target for artillery. A dispersed formation cannot maintain its attack momentum. The coordination between Soviet air and ground forces was imperfect. Communications were poor. Timing was often off. But the introduction of the PTAB meant that every German armored advance now had to account for the possibility of devastating attack from above. It changed the calculus. Changed the battle. And the Germans had no counter-weapon. The Luftwaffe had no equivalent ordnance. German ground attack aircraft, the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka and the Henschel HS-129, relied on heavy cannons and anti-tank rockets. Both required precision and exposed the aircraft to ground fire during prolonged attack runs. The PTAB required only that Soviet pilots fly over the target and release. If they were shot down afterward, the bomblets were already on their way. By July 13th, Hitler called off Operation Citadel. The official reason was the Anglo-American invasion of Sicily, which required German forces to be redeployed to Italy. But the offensive had already stalled. German forces in the southern sector of the Kursk salient had advanced 20 miles before being stopped at Prokhorovka in the largest tank battle in history. In the north, Field Marshal Model's forces had advanced barely 6 miles before grinding to a halt against Soviet defenses. The 9th Panzer Division and others had been bled white. Not destroyed, but rendered combat ineffective. The losses were staggering. Modern research suggests that German tank losses at Kursk were actually lower than Soviet propaganda claimed. Somewhere between 323 and 760 tanks destroyed, depending on how you count damaged vehicles that were later recovered and repaired. The Soviets lost far more, perhaps 6,000 tanks. But the Germans could not replace their losses. The Soviet factories east of the Ural Mountains were producing tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. And the Soviets had learned something at Kursk. They had learned that German armor, even Tigers and Panthers, even the latest and best machines the Wehrmacht could field, could be stopped. Not just by superior numbers. Not just by accepting horrific losses. But by combined arms warfare. Artillery, anti-tank guns, dug-in tanks, minefields, and crucially air-power delivering weapons specifically designed to exploit the one vulnerability that tank designers could not eliminate. The vulnerability of the top armor. The PTAB continued in service for the rest of the war. Production reached over 1.5 million units by 1945. Il-2 Sturmovix and other Soviet aircraft used them in every major operation from Kursk onward. They were dropped on German defensive positions at the Siege of Leningrad. They were used during Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive of 1944 that destroyed Army Group Center. They were dropped on German armor during the final assault on Berlin. The Germans never developed an effective counter. They tried thickening top armor on some tanks, but the weight penalty was prohibitive. They tried improving anti-aircraft defenses, but Soviet air superiority grew overwhelming by late 1944. They tried camouflage and concealment, but Soviet reconnaissance and intelligence gathering improved steadily. In the end, the most effective defense was to avoid concentrating armor where Soviet ground attack aircraft could reach it, which meant avoiding concentration entirely, which meant giving up the massed armored offensives that had been the core of German doctrine since 1939. A 5.5-pound bomblet, derided as a toy by Luftwaffe intelligence when they first examined a captured example, had contributed to the collapse of German offensive capability on the Eastern Front. Not alone. The Soviets won Kursk through superiority in men, artillery, defensive preparation, and sheer determination. But the PTAB was part of that victory. A small part in physical terms. A massive part in psychological impact. It taught German tank crews that nowhere was safe. Not even inside 60 tons of armor plate. And it taught Soviet commanders that air power, properly applied with proper weapons, could do more than harass and disrupt. Could kill. After July 13, 1943, the Wehrmacht never launched another major offensive on the Eastern Front. From Kursk onward, the Red Army advanced westward. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. The distance from Kursk to Berlin is approximately 1,400 kilometers. It took the Soviets 22 months to cover that distance. 22 months of brutal, grinding combat. Millions of casualties. Entire cities destroyed. But the advance never stopped. And overhead, for much of that distance, IL-2 Sturmovix flew their missions, carrying weapons that had proven, decisively, that armor was not invincible. That the sky was as dangerous as the ground. That a weapon need not be sophisticated or expensive to be devastatingly effective if it exploited a fundamental weakness in the enemy's strongest asset. The lessons of the PTAB 2.5-1.5 rippled far beyond the summer of 1943. Military planners across the world took notice, though the details remained classified throughout the war. The principle was undeniable. Shaped charge technology, miniaturized and delivered from the air in quantity, had fundamentally altered the relationship between aircraft and armor. Western Allied forces developed their own versions, though none saw combat use as extensive as the Soviet weapon. The Americans experimented with cluster munitions containing shaped charge submunitions, but their focus remained on heavier bombs and rockets. The British, facing fewer concentrated armored threats after North Africa, invested less in the concept. It was the Soviets who had needed it most urgently, and who had deployed it most effectively. After the war, military analysts studied the Kursk operation exhaustively. What they found surprised many. The PTAB had not achieved the kill rates Soviet propaganda claimed. Many of the destroyed tanks had been recovered and repaired. Shaped charge penetration was effective, but not every hit resulted in catastrophic vehicle loss. Crews could survive. Fires could be extinguished. Tanks could be salvaged. But that wasn't the point. The point was what happened to German operational doctrine after July 1943. Field commanders began dispersing their armor to avoid presenting concentrated targets. They scheduled movements for night or poor weather when Soviet air activity was reduced. They positioned anti-aircraft assets to protect armored units, diverting resources from other purposes. All of this reduced the effectiveness of German armored formations. Not because every tank was destroyed, but because the threat of destruction from above forced changes in how those tanks could be employed. This was the TAB's true achievement. It was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. It introduced uncertainty into a domain where German commanders had previously felt confident. A Tiger tank commander could calculate his odds against AT-34. He could estimate the threat from anti-tank guns based on their deployment. But against an enemy that could appear overhead with seconds of warning and blanket his position with armor-piercing bomblets, there was no calculation, only hope that the attack would miss, or that he wouldn't be the unlucky one. Modern military technology has made the PTAB obsolete. Precision-guided munitions can strike individual vehicles from standoff distances. Anti-tank missiles with tandem warheads can defeat even the most advanced reactive armor. Attack helicopters can engage armored columns from beyond visual range. The crude area effect weapon that Larionov designed has been replaced by systems far more sophisticated and far more lethal. But the fundamental vulnerability it exploited remains. Top armor is still thinner than frontal armor on every tank in service today. The physics haven't changed. Additional protection means additional weight, which means reduced mobility and increased fuel consumption. Tank designers still make the same calculated compromises their predecessors made in 1943. And weapons that attack from above, whether dropped from aircraft, fired from artillery, or guided from drones, still target that same weakness. Lieutenant Mikhail Grishin survived the war. He flew over 200 combat missions in his Il-2 Sturmovik. He was shot down once, crash-landed behind Soviet lines, and was back in the air within a week. After the war, he worked as a test pilot for Soviet aviation factories. He died in 1987, having lived to see the development of weapons that made his combat missions seem almost quaint by comparison. But in July 1943, flying at 320 feet above the Kursk salient with German flak bursting around him and Tigers visible below, he carried weapons that helped change history. 70 tanks of the 9th Panzer Division. That's the number Soviet records claim. German records suggest fewer. The exact figure will never be known with certainty. But what is certain is this. After July 7, 1943, German tank crews knew that their greatest protection, their armor, had a flaw they couldn't fix. And the Soviets knew how to exploit it. War is often decided not by the strongest weapon, but by the weapon that appears at the right moment against an enemy unprepared to counter it. The PTAB 2.5-1.5 was not the strongest anti-tank weapon of World War II. It was not the most sophisticated. But for a crucial period, during the most important battle on the Eastern Front, it was exactly what the Red Army needed. 5.5 pounds of shaped charge explosive in a tumbling steel casing. A toy, German intelligence called it. A toy that helped stop the Wehrmacht's last great offensive. A toy that taught a generation of soldiers that invincibility is an illusion, and that every defense, no matter how formidable, has a weakness waiting to be exploited. From Kursk to Berlin, the message carried by those small bomblets was clear. Look up. The danger isn't always in front of you. Sometimes it falls from the sky, silent and sudden, a solution so simple that no one saw it coming until it was too late. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.